What would you do if someone called claiming to be your grandson in desperate need of money? Would you send it immediately? Would you verify their identity first? Would you call the police? Well, when I got my fourth fake grandchild emergency call, I decided to play along and teach these scammers a lesson they'd never forget.
My name is Betty Patterson, and I'm 77 years old. Everyone in Millbrook thinks they know my story. The retired school teacher, who never married, never had children, and lives alone in the little blue house on Elm Street, with nothing but my books and my memories for company. They see this gray-haired old woman doing her grocery shopping and think I'm just another lonely senior citizen, an easy target for anyone clever enough to prey on my isolation. What they don't know is that I spent 45 years teaching high school, dealing with teenage liars, manipulators, and con artists who thought they could outsmart their English teacher. What they especially don't know is that those decades of experience taught me exactly how to spot deception, and more importantly, how to turn the tables on anyone foolish enough to try to deceive me. The scam started 3 months ago with a phone call that nearly broke my heart. It was 2:30 in the morning, and when my bedside phone rang with that urgent middle-of-the-night insistence, my first thought was that someone I cared about was hurt or dying. At my age, calls that come after midnight are rarely good news. "Grandma Betty," the voice was young, male, and thick with tears. "Grandma, it's me. It's Tommy. I'm in so much trouble." "Tommy? I don't have any grandsons named Tommy. I don't have any grandsons at all." But the voice was so desperate, so frightened, that for a moment my heart overruled my head, and I found myself responding to this unknown boy's distress. "Tommy? Honey, what's wrong? Where are you?" "I'm in jail, Grandma. I was visiting friends in Miami, and there was this party, and the police came, and they arrested everyone. They're saying I had drugs in my car, but I swear I don't know how they got there. Someone must have put them there." The story poured out between sobs. A college student visiting Florida for spring break, a party that got out of hand, planted evidence, corrupt police, and a bail amount of $8,000 that had to be paid immediately or he'd be stuck in jail for weeks waiting for a court date. "Please don't tell Mom and Dad," he begged. "They'll kill me if they find out. You're the only one I can trust, the only one who's ever believed in me. Can you help me? I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I get home." For 20 minutes I listened to this boy pour out his heart, describing his fear of being in jail with dangerous criminals, his panic about missing his final exams, his shame about disappointing the family. The emotional manipulation was expertly done. Just the right amount of desperation without being overdramatic. Just enough specific details to sound believable without being too elaborate. If I had actually been a lonely grandmother desperate for family connection, I probably would have rushed to Western Union that very night to wire the money. The scammers had done their psychological homework, targeting my supposed vulnerability with surgical precision. But here's what they didn't know. I might not have children or grandchildren, but I do have something even better. 45 years of experience dealing with creative storytellers who thought they could manipulate their way out of consequences. I'd heard every sob story, every family emergency, every desperate plea that teenage minds could concoct. And this Tommy was using techniques that wouldn't have fooled me when I was 25, let alone at 77. The second call came 2 weeks later, this time from Jessica, my supposed granddaughter who was stranded in Europe after having her purse stolen in Rome. Same basic structure: family member in distress, urgent need for money, plea for secrecy to avoid disappointing the parents. Different voice, different story, same fundamental scam. The third call featured Michael, supposedly my grandson, who'd been in a car accident in Canada and needed money for medical expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. By then, I was certain these were professional scammers working from a call center somewhere, probably targeting elderly people across multiple states with the same basic script adapted to different supposed emergencies. But it was the fourth call that made me decide to stop being a passive victim and start being an active participant in their downfall. This time it was Brandon, claiming to be my grandson, who'd gotten into legal trouble during a college trip to Las Vegas. The story was more elaborate than the previous calls. A bar fight that got out of hand, charges being filed, a lawyer who needed to be paid immediately to prevent Brandon from being expelled from college and having his future ruined. "Grandma Betty, I know you don't have a lot of money," Brandon said, his voice perfectly calibrated to sound ashamed and desperate. "But if you could just loan me $12,000, I swear I'll work every day for the rest of my life to pay you back." You're the only family member who's ever believed in me." That's when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hanging up or telling this fake Brandon exactly what I thought of his story, I decided to play along, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to see exactly how far these scammers would go, and more importantly, because I wanted to make sure they never had the chance to victimize other elderly people. "Oh my goodness, Brandon," I said, letting my voice shake with what sounded like elderly confusion and panic. "This is terrible." "Of course I'll help you, sweetheart. You're my grandson, and family takes care of family." I could practically hear the satisfaction in his voice as he realized he'd hooked what he thought was a perfect victim. Over the next hour, he walked me through the process of wiring money, explained about using fake names to protect my privacy, and gave me detailed instructions about what to say at Western Union to avoid any questions. But while Brandon thought he was reeling in a confused old woman, I was actually gathering intelligence about their operation. I recorded the entire conversation, noting the background noises, the specific terminology they used, and most importantly, the wire transfer information they wanted me to use. Because here's what these professional scammers didn't know about retired English teacher Betty Patterson. I might not have grandchildren of my own, but I did have something far more valuable in this situation. I had contacts in law enforcement who'd been looking for exactly this kind of evidence to shut down the elder scam operations that had been targeting our community. And I had a plan that would give these fake grandchildren exactly the kind of family reunion they deserved. The most shocking part of their operation was yet to be revealed. The next morning, I called Detective Maria Santos, who'd given a presentation about elder fraud at our community center 6 months earlier. Detective Santos had specifically asked attendees to contact her if they ever received suspicious calls, and she'd emphasized that elderly people shouldn't feel embarrassed about being targeted. These scammers were professionals who studied their victims carefully. "Mrs. Patterson," Detective Santos said when I explained what had been happening, "you did exactly the right thing by not sending money. But the fact that you recorded that last call could be incredibly valuable. These operations are usually run from overseas, making them very difficult to track and prosecute." She explained that the Grandparent Scam had become one of the most lucrative forms of elder fraud, with professional operations targeting thousands of elderly people across the country. The scammers would cold call numbers, fishing for someone who sounded elderly and vulnerable, then adapt their story based on the victim's responses. "They've got it down to a science," Detective Santos told me. "They research obituaries and social media to find names and family information. They practice emotional manipulation techniques. Some operations even have actors who specialize in playing different roles: the distressed grandchild, the helpful lawyer, the sympathetic jail official." But what made my case special was that the scammers had made a crucial mistake. They'd called the same victim multiple times, apparently not keeping good enough records to realize they'd already tried to scam me. That suggested their operation was large enough that individual operators weren't tracking their previous contacts carefully. "If you're willing to help us," Detective Santos said, "we'd like you to play along with the next call. Let them think they've convinced you to send money. Set up the transfer, then we'll be waiting when they try to collect it." The plan she outlined was more complex than I'd expected. This wasn't just about catching one scammer. It was about infiltrating an entire network that had been stealing millions of dollars from elderly victims across multiple states. My case could be the key to bringing down an organization that had been operating with impunity for years. Over the next week, Detective Santos educated me about how these scams actually worked. The callers I'd been hearing were probably just the front line, low-level operators working from scripts. Behind them was a sophisticated organization, with money launderers, technology specialists, and coordinators who managed the entire operation. The wire transfers didn't go directly to the scammers. They went to mules, usually people who'd been recruited through fake job advertisements to receive money transfers and forward them to other accounts. These mules often had no idea they were part of a criminal operation, thinking they were working for a legitimate money transfer business. "The beautiful thing about your situation," Detective Santos explained, "is that they keep calling you back. That suggests they see you as a particularly promising target, which means they'll invest more resources in trying to scam you. If we play this right, we might be able to trace their operation all the way back to the source." We spent hours preparing for the next call. Detective Santos taught me exactly what to say to sound like a confused but willing victim, how to ask the right questions to get information we needed, and most importantly, how to keep the scammers on the line long enough for the FBI's technical team to trace their location. The recording equipment they installed in my house was more sophisticated than anything I'd imagined. Hidden microphones that would pick up every word, digital recorders that would capture phone conversations in perfect quality, and computer systems that would analyze the calls in real time to extract technical information about where they were coming from. "Mrs. Patterson," Detective Santos said as we finished setting up the equipment, "I want you to understand that this could be dangerous. These people have stolen millions of dollars from elderly victims, and they won't appreciate being exposed. If they figure out what you're doing, they might try to retaliate." But I wasn't worried about retaliation. I was thinking about all the lonely elderly people who'd received these same calls and actually believed they were helping beloved grandchildren in distress. I was thinking about the thousands of dollars being stolen every day from people who could barely afford their medications, let alone bail money for fake emergencies. The fifth call came 3 days later, and this time I was ready. "Grandma Betty, it's Brandon. I'm still in jail, and things have gotten worse." This Brandon's voice was different from the previous one, probably a different operator, or maybe they'd forgotten which persona they'd used with me before. The story had evolved too. Now he was facing additional charges. The lawyer needed more money, and there was a deadline after which he'd be transferred to a maximum security facility with dangerous criminals. "Oh, Brandon," I said, letting my voice shake with elderly fear and confusion. "This is so frightening. I've been so worried about you. How can I help?" For 45 minutes, I played the perfect victim, while Detective Santos and her team traced the call and recorded every word. I asked all the questions they'd taught me to ask, gathered the information they needed, and most importantly, convinced the scammers that I was completely under their control. By the end of the call, we'd arranged for me to wire $15,000 to a specific location the next morning, with detailed instructions about using a fake name and story to avoid suspicion from Western Union employees. But what the scammers didn't know was that instead of an elderly victim walking into Western Union with their money, they were going to find federal agents waiting to arrest everyone involved in their operation. The trap was set, and these fake grandchildren were about to get exactly the kind of family attention they deserved. What we discovered about their operation would shock everyone who thought they understood how elder fraud worked. The morning of the sting operation, I woke up feeling like I was about to perform in the most important play of my life. After 45 years of teaching teenagers who thought they could outsmart their English teacher, I was finally going to use those skills against criminals who thought they could outsmart a grandmother. Detective Santos arrived at my house at 8 a.m. with a team of FBI agents who looked far too young to be carrying such serious responsibilities. They transformed my quiet living room into a command center, with computer screens showing trace routes, recording equipment monitoring phone lines, and communication devices connecting us to law enforcement agencies across 3 states. "Mrs. Patterson," Agent Williams explained as they finished setting up the equipment, "we've confirmed that this operation is much larger than we initially suspected. Your calls have been traced to a facility in Miami that's coordinating scams across the entire Southeast. They've stolen an estimated $4.2 million from elderly victims in the past 18 months. The plan was more complex than I'd expected. I wouldn't actually be going to Western Union. Instead, an undercover agent, who looked appropriately grandmother-like, would make the transfer while I stayed home monitoring the operation. Other agents would be positioned at money pickup locations across Florida, ready to arrest anyone who tried to collect the funds. But the most important part of my role was still to come. They needed me to make one more call to the scammers, ostensibly to confirm that I'd sent the money, but actually to gather intelligence about how their operation was structured and where the money was ultimately going. At 10:30 a.m., exactly when I'd been instructed to call, I dialed the number Brandon had given me. My hands were steady as I held the phone, but my heart was racing with anticipation. This was it, the moment when weeks of preparation would either pay off in a major law enforcement victory or fail spectacularly. "Hello?" The voice that answered wasn't Brandon. It was an older man with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "Oh, hello," I said, using the confused elderly woman voice I'd perfected. "I'm trying to reach Brandon. He told me to call this number after I sent the money." "Brandon's not available right now," the man said, his tone becoming more focused. "But I'm his lawyer." "Did you complete the transfer?" This was a new wrinkle we hadn't expected, but Detective Santos was nodding encouragingly from across the room, indicating I should play along with this development. Yes, I went to Western Union just like Brandon told me to, I said. I sent the $15,000 to the name he gave me, but I'm so worried about my grandson. When will he be able to come home? What followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. This lawyer was far more sophisticated than the previous callers, using legal terminology and procedural details that would have convinced most people he was legitimate. He explained about court schedules, bail procedures, and additional complications that would require even more money. But he also made a crucial mistake. He started bragging about how many clients he was helping, how many young people he'd saved from similar situations, how grateful their families had been for his assistance. Just this week, he said, I've helped 12 other grandparents save their grandchildren from similar situations. It's heartbreaking how often these young people make mistakes that could ruin their entire futures. 12 other grandparents. This week alone. As I listened to him describe his supposed success stories, I realized we were documenting not just one scam, but an entire assembly line of elder abuse that had been operating for months or possibly years. The FBI agents in my living room were furiously taking notes as the fake lawyer revealed detail after detail about their operation. He mentioned specific Western Union locations, talked about coordination with other legal professionals in different states, and most damaging of all, referenced a database of elderly targets they'd been cultivating. Your grandson mentioned that you're a retired teacher, he said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. We find that educators are often the most understanding when young people make mistakes. You understand that everyone deserves a second chance. The way he said it made my skin crawl, because I realized they'd been profiling me not just as a Pichel victim, but as a specific type of victim. They'd identified my profession, probably researched my background, and crafted their approach specifically to exploit what they saw as my likely personality traits. But while this fake lawyer thought he was manipulating a confused old woman, he was actually providing evidence that would help prosecute dozens of cases against his operation. Every word he spoke was being recorded, analyzed, and cross-referenced with other ongoing investigations. After 30 minutes of conversation, during which I played the grateful grandmother while he described increasingly elaborate schemes to extract more money, Detective Santos indicated that we had enough evidence to move to the next phase of the operation. Sir, I said, letting a note of concern creep into my voice. I'm starting to worry that something's not right here. My nephew called this morning asking why someone was inquiring about Brandon at his college, and Brandon's supposed to be registered there, but the registrar said they've never had a student by that name. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For the first time in our conversation, the footh-talking lawyer seemed to be at a loss for words. I'm sorry. What did you say your name was again? He asked, and I could hear suspicion creeping into his voice. Betty Patterson, I replied sweetly. And I'm starting to think someone's been lying me about my grandson, Brandon, because the more I think about it, the more I realize I don't actually have a grandson named Brandon. What happened next was exactly what Detective Santos had hoped for. Instead of hanging up immediately, the fake lawyer's panic made him reveal even more about their operation, as he tried to figure out how much we knew and whether their entire network was compromised. Listen carefully, he said, his voice becoming threatening for the first time. You don't want to make trouble for yourself, old lady. We know where you live. We know your routines. You'd better keep your mouth shut about this conversation. Those threats, captured in perfect digital quality, would become some of the most important evidence in the prosecution case. Because this wasn't just fraud anymore. It was intimidation of a witness, extortion, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse on a massive scale. But the fake lawyer's threats had revealed something else that would make this case even more significant. They did know where I lived, which meant they'd been conducting surveillance on their victims, and possibly planning more serious crimes against elderly people who didn't cooperate with their scams. As I hung up the phone, Detective Santos was already coordinating with agents across 3 states to execute simultaneous raids on locations they'd identified during our conversation. The information we'd gathered had given them enough evidence to obtain warrants for multiple arrests. But the most satisfying part was still to come. Watching these professional manipulators face the consequences of thinking they could outsmart a retired school teacher who'd been dealing with liars and con artists since before they were born. The real scope of their crimes was about to be revealed, and it was far worse than anyone had imagined. Within 2 hours of ending my call with the fake lawyer, law enforcement agencies across 3 states were executing coordinated raids on locations connected to what they'd discovered was called Operation Family Emergency. The scope of the criminal network was far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. I watched from my living room as Detective Santos coordinated with teams in Miami, Atlanta, and Houston, each reporting successful arrests and seizures of evidence that painted a picture of systematic elder abuse on an industrial scale. The command center that had been set up in my house became the nerve center for what would become the largest elder fraud prosecution in the region's history. Mrs. Patterson, Agent Williams said as reports came in from the field teams, "What you've helped us accomplish today is extraordinary. We've arrested 23 individuals so far, seized over $800,000 in cash and money orders, and recovered computer equipment that contains evidence of thousands of attempted scams." The Miami location turned out to be exactly what we'd suspected: a professional call center where operators worked from scripts targeting elderly people across the country with coordinated emotional manipulation. The facility had multiple phone lines, sophisticated computer systems for tracking victims, and detailed training materials that taught scammers how to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of different types of elderly targets. But the most disturbing discovery was what they found in the databases: detailed profiles of thousands of elderly people, including their financial information, family situations, and psychological assessments that rated their likelihood of falling for different types of scams. My own profile was extensive, containing information about my career as a teacher, my unmarried status, my financial situation derived from public records, and most unsettling of all, notes about my high empathy rating that made me a prime target for fake family emergency scams. "They've been researching you for months," Detective Santos explained as she reviewed the seized files. "They knew your profession, your address, your daily routines, even your shopping habits. This wasn't random cold calling. You were specifically targeted because their psychological profile suggested you'd be vulnerable to family-related manipulation." The fake lawyer I'd spoken with turned out to be the operations coordinator, a man named Richard Chen who'd been running similar scams for over 5 years. His arrest revealed that he wasn't just coordinating grandparent scams, but multiple types of fraud targeting elderly victims: fake charity solicitations, bogus sweepstakes winnings that required fees to collect, and even romance scams targeting lonely widows and widowers. But perhaps the most significant arrest was of the operations technology specialist, a woman named Sandra Martinez who developed disaffected systems for laundering the stolen money through networks of unwitting accomplices. Her computers contained evidence of money transfers totaling over $8.2 million stolen from elderly victims across the country. The human cost of their operation was staggering. Among the evidence seized were recordings of hundreds of calls to elderly victims, many of whom had sent their life savings to help fake grandchildren in manufactured emergencies. So victims had sent money multiple times, convinced that their beloved grandchildren kept encountering new crises that required financial assistance. One recording particularly broke my heart. An 84-year-old man in Ohio who'd sent his entire $23,000 life savings to help his grandson get out of jail, money he'd needed for his own medical care. Another victim, a 79-year-old woman in Georgia, had taken out a second mortgage on her house to provide bail money for a fake granddaughter she'd never actually met, but loved deeply through the manipulative phone calls. The investigation also revealed that my case wasn't unique. Several other elderly people had figured out they were being scammed and had contacted law enforcement, but I was apparently the first victim who'd been willing to actively participate in a sting operation, which had provided the evidence needed to bring down the entire network. 3 days after the initial arrests, Detective Santos called to update me on the continuing investigation. "Mrs. Patterson, we've now arrested 37 individuals connected to this operation, and we're still finding more evidence every day. The computer forensics team estimates that this network stole over $12 million from elderly victims over the past 3 years. But the most satisfying news was about the fake Brandon who'd started this whole investigation with his tearful call claiming to be my grandson in jail. His real name was Kevin Walsh, and he'd been one of the operation's most successful scammers, specializing in emotional manipulation of elderly women. His arrest had led to the recovery of over $400,000 in stolen money that could be returned to victims. The fake lawyer, Richard Martinez, was facing federal charges that could result in life in prison. His threats against me during our recorded conversation had elevated the charges to include witness intimidation and conspiracy to commit violence against elderly victims. But perhaps the most important outcome was the information they'd gathered about similar operations in other states. The evidence we'd collected was being shared with law enforcement agencies across the country, leading to investigations and arrests that would protect thousands of elderly people from becoming victims of these professional manipulators. 6 months later, I testified at Richard Martinez's trial, describing how his operation had targeted me and thousands of other elderly people with systematic psychological manipulation designed to steal our life savings while exploiting our love for family members we'd never actually met. Your Honor, I said during my victim impact statement, these criminals didn't just steal money from elderly people. They stole our trust, our sense of safety, and our willingness to help family members in genuine emergencies. They weaponized our love against us, turning our greatest strength, our care for younger generations, into a tool for our own victimization. Martinez was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, and his operation was dismantled completely. The money they'd stolen was used to compensate victims, though for many elderly people, the financial recovery couldn't repair the emotional damage of learning that their beloved grandchildren had never existed. But the most meaningful outcome wasn't the convictions or the recovered money. It was knowing that this network would never again be able to prey on vulnerable elderly people who answered their phones hoping to hear from family members who loved them. The retired English teacher who'd spent 45 years dealing with teenage con artists had finally used those skills to turn an entire generation from predators who thought elderly people were easy marks. But the story didn't end with the trial. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life that I never could have anticipated. The conviction of Richard Martinez and his network made national news. But what surprised me most wasn't the media attention. It was the phone calls that started coming from elderly people across the country who'd heard about the case and wanted to share their own experiences with similar scams. Within weeks of the trial's conclusion, I was receiving calls from elderly victims in over 20 states, people who'd been targeted by grandparent scams, romance scams, fake charity solicitations, and dozens of other schemes designed to exploit our generation's trust and willingness to help others. The stories were heartbreaking, but also infuriating. Margaret Thompson, 82, from Oregon, had sent her entire $45,000 retirement savings to help a fake grandson supposedly arrested in Mexico. Robert Martinez, 78, from Arizona, had been convinced to invest his life savings in a fake investment scheme pitched by someone claiming to be his late son's business partner. Dorothy Chang, 84, from Florida, had developed an online romance with a man who turned out to be a professional scammer who'd stolen her identity and her heart simultaneously. But what struck me most about these conversations wasn't just the financial losses. It was the shame and isolation these victims felt. Many had never told their families about being scammed, too embarrassed to admit they'd been fooled by criminals who'd seemed so convincing. Others had been blamed by family members who couldn't understand how intelligent, experienced people could fall for such obvious lies. That's when I realized that my work wasn't finished with Martinez's conviction. There were thousands of elderly people across the country who needed to understand that being targeted by these professional scammers wasn't a sign of weakness or stupidity. It was evidence of how sophisticated and ruthless these criminals had become. Detective Santos helped me connect with a nonprofit organization called ElderShield, which focused on protecting seniors from financial fraud and abuse. They'd been looking for someone to help develop educational programs based on real experience with scammer tactics, and my case provided exactly the kind of practical knowledge they needed. Mrs. Patterson, said ElderShield Director James Rodriguez, what makes your story so valuable isn't just that you avoided being scammed, it's that you understood their psychology well enough to turn the tables on them. That insight could help protect thousands of other elderly people. Together, we developed a series of educational presentations that I began delivering at senior centers, community groups, and retirement communities across the region. But instead of just warning people about scam techniques, I focused on teaching them how to think like the scammers, to understand the psychological manipulation tactics that made these schemes so effective. The most important thing to understand, I would tell my audiences, is that these scammers are professionals who study us just as carefully as we might study a difficult crossword puzzle. They know our weaknesses, our fears, our desires, and they craft their approaches specifically to exploit those vulnerabilities. I describe how Martinez's operation had profiled potential victims, how they'd researched our backgrounds and family situations, how they'd practiced emotional manipulation techniques until they could produce tears and desperation on command. But I'd also emphasize that understanding their methods was the key to defeating them. The response was always powerful. Elderly people who'd felt ashamed about being targeted by scammers began to understand that they'd been facing professional criminals using sophisticated psychological warfare. Family members who'd been frustrated with elderly relatives for falling for obvious scams began to appreciate how difficult these schemes were to recognize when you were the target. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from people who'd been targeted but hadn't fallen for the scams, often because they'd remembered something from one of my presentations. Dorothy Martinez, no relation to Richard, called to tell me she'd received a grandparent scam call that sounded exactly like the examples I'd described and had been able to recognize the manipulation immediately. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "when that boy called crying about being in jail, I could hear your voice in my head describing exactly those tactics. Instead of panicking about my grandson, I hung up and called my daughter to verify that he was safe at home. That presentation saved me from losing my savings. Within a year, I was traveling across 3 states delivering presentations to audiences that sometimes numbered in the hundreds: elder care facilities, senior centers, church groups, and community organizations all wanted to hear about practical techniques for protecting themselves from professional scammers. But the work also led to something I hadn't expected: connections with other elderly people who'd fought back against criminals who thought age made them vulnerable. I met Margaret Foster, 79, who'd exposed a fake charity that had been stealing donations intended for veterans. I connected with Robert Chen, 81, who'd helped FBI agents catch romance scammers who'd targeted him through online dating sites. Together, we formed what we called the Silver Shield Network, a group of elderly volunteers who worked with law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate scams targeting our generation. We became consultants on cases involving elder fraud, using our understanding of scammer psychology to help younger investigators recognize tactics they might miss. The network grew to include over 200 elderly volunteers across 15 states, each contributing expertise based on their own experiences with different types of fraud. We developed training materials for law enforcement, created educational resources for families, and most importantly, provided support for elderly victims who needed to understand that being targeted by professional criminals wasn't their fault. But the most satisfying aspect of the work was knowing that every person we educated, every scam we helped expose, every victim we supported was a victory against criminals who thought our generation was made up of helpless, isolated targets. The retired English teacher, who'd spent her career dealing with teenagers' lies and manipulations, had discovered a new calling in her 70s: protecting fellow seniors from predators who thought experience and wisdom were signs of vulnerability rather than strength. And Richard Martinez, serving his 25-year sentence in federal prison, had inadvertently created something he never intended: a network of empowered elderly people who were making it much harder for scammers to find easy victims. But the most important lesson I learned from the entire experience was still to come. 5 years have passed since that first fake Brandon called me crying about being in jail. And I'm 82 years old now. The little blue house on Elm Street is still my home, but it's no longer the quiet refuge of a solitary retired teacher. It's become an unofficial headquarters for the Silver Shield Network, with a phone that rings regularly with calls from elderly people who need advice about suspicious contacts, law enforcement officers working on fraud cases, and reporters who want to understand how professional scammers target our generation. The work has given me something I never expected to have at this stage of my life: a sense of purpose that makes every day feel valuable and meaningful. But more than that, it's taught me lessons about strength, resilience, and the power of experience that I wish I'd understood decades earlier. The most important lesson has been about the difference between being vulnerable and being victimizable. Every elderly person faces certain vulnerabilities. We're more likely to live alone. We may have health issues that make us dependent on others, and we often have more limited social networks than younger people. But vulnerability doesn't equal victimizability, and understanding that distinction has been crucial to protecting myself and helping others do the same. Scammers like Richard Martinez succeeded because they confused natural human emotions, love, worry, desire to help, with weaknesses that could be exploited. But those same emotions, when combined with experience and wisdom, can actually be sources of tremendous strength. The love that made me want to help a fake grandson in distress was the same love that motivated me to spend months building a case against the criminals who were preying on other elderly people. The Silver Shield Network has now helped expose over 40 different scam operations across 12 states, leading to more than 200 arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen money. But the statistics, impressive as they are, don't capture what I consider our most important accomplishment: changing how elderly people see themselves and how society sees our generation. Too often, discussions about elder fraud focus on how to protect elderly people, as if we're inherently helpless and need others to save us from our own poor judgment. That narrative not only fails to recognize our capabilities, it actually makes us more vulnerable by reinforcing the idea that age equals incompetence. The truth is exactly the opposite. Most of us have survived decades of challenges that required quick thinking, good judgment, and the ability to recognize deception. We've raised families, built careers, managed households through economic hardships, and navigated complex social situations that younger people haven't even encountered yet. The idea that reaching a certain age suddenly makes us incapable of sound judgment is not just wrong, it's dangerous because it gives criminals permission to treat us as easy targets. The educational work I do now focuses on helping elderly people recognize their own strengths rather than just warning them about external threat. Yes, we need to understand how scammers operate, but more importantly, we need to trust our own instincts and experience when something doesn't feel right. Dorothy Martinez, the woman who avoided a grandparent scam after attending one of my presentations, put it perfectly. I realized that in 79 years of life, I'd never had a grandchild who couldn't call his parents when he was in trouble. Why would this be different? That kind of practical wisdom, based on decades of real-world experience, is our greatest defense against professional manipulators. But it only works if we're confident enough in our own judgment to trust it over the emotional manipulation of skilled criminals. The Silver Shield Network has also taught me about the power of community in protecting vulnerable people. Isolation is a scammer's best friend because it eliminates the possibility that someone might ask questions, offer different perspectives, or simply provide emotional support that makes it easier to think clearly under pressure. Many of the elderly people who've been successfully scammed weren't just isolated physically, they were isolated emotionally, cut off from family members or friends who might have helped them recognize that something wasn't right. The fake family connections offered by scammers filled a genuine need for human connection, which made the deception much more powerful. But when elderly people have strong support networks, when they feel connected to their communities, when they have people they can call for advice or simply to talk through confusing situations, they become much harder targets for professional criminals. The network has grown beyond just fraud prevention. We've become a community of elderly people who support each other through the challenges of aging while refusing to accept that growing older means becoming helpless. Members help each other with technology questions that might prevent them from falling for online scams, share information about legitimate resources for seniors, and provide the kind of social connection that makes emotional manipulation less effective. Last month, I received a call from a woman named Patricia Rodriguez, 78, who'd heard about our work through a friend. She'd been getting calls from someone claiming to be from Medicare, asking for her personal information to update her benefits. Something about the calls felt wrong, but she wasn't sure whether her suspicions were justified or if she was just being paranoid. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I keep thinking about what you said in that article about trusting our instincts. This caller keeps pressing me for information, and every time I ask questions, he gets irritated and tries to make me feel stupid for not understanding. Does that sound like something a real Medicare employee would do?" Patricia had answered her own question. Her decades of experience with legitimate customer service had taught her how professional representatives actually behave, and this caller's responses didn't match that pattern. We talked through her suspicions, confirmed that Medicare doesn't make unsolicited calls requesting personal information, and helped her report the attempted scam to the appropriate authorities. The attempted scammer had made the same mistake that so many criminals make when targeting elderly people. He'd assumed that age meant gullibility, when actually age meant experience with how legitimate organizations operate. The house on Elm Street has become a gathering place for elderly people who refuse to see themselves as victims in waiting. We meet monthly to share information about new scam techniques, discuss suspicious contacts we've received, and most importantly, to reinforce for each other that being targeted by criminals isn't a sign of weakness. It's evidence of how sophisticated these operations have become. Sometimes younger family members join our meetings, not to protect us from our supposed poor judgment, but to learn from our experience and understanding of how these criminals operate. The generational exchange of knowledge benefits everyone and helps break down the stereotypes that make elderly people more vulnerable to exploitation. The work has also given me a different perspective on my 45 years as a teacher. At the time, I thought I was educating teenagers about literature and writing, but I realize now that I was actually learning to recognize deception, manipulation, and the psychological tactics that people use when they're trying to get something they don't deserve. Every fake excuse for missed homework, every fabricated family emergency designed to get extension on assignments, every attempt at emotional manipulation to improve grades was actually preparation for recognizing the same tactics when they were used by professional criminals with much higher stakes. Richard Martinez and his network of scammers thought they were targeting a lonely old teacher who would be grateful for fake family connections. What they actually found was someone who'd spent decades studying human behavior, recognizing lies and developing strategies for dealing with people who thought they were smarter than everyone around them. The irony is perfect. The career that prepared me most for fighting elders was teaching high school. Both involve dealing with people who are convinced they're cleverer than they actually are, who think emotional manipulation is a substitute for honest communication, and who believe that targeting someone they see as vulnerable makes them powerful, rather than pathetic. My name is Betty Patterson. I'm 82 years old, and I've learned that the best way to protect yourself from predators is to remember that experience is strength, not weakness. Wisdom is power, not vulnerability. And sometimes the most dangerous person in any conversation is the one who looks like a harmless retired teacher, but spent 45 years learning to recognize liars. If you're listening to this story and someone contacts you claiming to be family in distress, claiming to represent an organization you do business with, or claiming to offer you something that seems too good to be true, trust the instincts you've developed over decades of dealing with people who want something from you. And remember that the scammers counting on you to be grateful, confused, and isolated are about to discover that our generation survived the Great Depression, world wars, and countless personal challenges by being stronger, smarter, and more resourceful than anyone expected. Sometimes the prey turns out to be the predator, and the hunter becomes the hunted.